This reflection is going to be on the classical Christian tradition, or the patristic era from the 2nd to the 7th centuries. Homer, particularly Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, and then soul formation itself, and how the fathers and mothers of the church used the classical tradition they had inherited and then applied it in terms of soul formation, spiritual disciplines, the nature of the faith journey itself. It's probably important to note that once Christianity emerged from its Jewish matrix, or the womb of Judaism, it encountered the larger, Hellenized late antique world, the classical world. So many of the women and men who had grown up in that classical, Hellenized late antique Roman world, their sacred texts and their upbringing and their education and formation would not have been on the Bible. But the Bible was a text mostly coming out of a Jewish tradition, and then as Christianity emerged out of that Jewish worldview and interpreted it differently, they encountered a classical civilization of Greek thought, Roman thought, and then, of course, Jewish thinking itself. So as Christianity spread, it encountered women and men who had been raised in a classical heritage. And so they would have inherited, as a part of their education, Homer, Hesiod, Virgil, Aeneid. And so that would have been the world they would have been shaped and formed within, just as in today, in a highly secular age, not that many people know the Bible very well at all, or if they do, a very limited, often, approach to interpreting it. So the myths they have inherited in our time, post-Christendom, post-Christian, would be epics such as Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. Many would have taken that in with their mother's milk. Some Chronicles of Narnia, Star Wars, Star Trek, many of the Marvel comics which are coming out. These are the stories that contemporary people inherit, and many just are not aware of the great classical tradition, certainly in the West, of the Jewish heritage, the Bible, much less the classical heritage of Greek and Roman and Celtic thought. And so when we think of the early Christians as they moved out of a Jewish heritage into a world shaped by the higher education of classical thought, the texts they would have taken in was, as I mentioned, Homer and Hesiod. That's their world, essentially. So when we think of the fathers of the West, and we think of them in the East, think of the early apologists within Christianity: Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen. Think of Ambrose, who comes a little later, Augustine, Jerome in the East, Gregory of Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil. These are key thinkers, theologians, exegetes, whose upbringing would have been biblical on the one hand, and yet these are people, including their sisters and mothers, who would have been shaped and formed by a classical literary education. So there are two streams in terms of how early Christians engaged with their broader classical cultural world. One is the philosophical tradition of the Pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, the significant works of these thinkers, Seneca, Cicero. We see Augustine constantly drawing from Seneca and Cicero and Varro. This was his Latin world. This is the world he grew up on, as well as the biblical world itself. But as I mentioned, there's the literary tradition as well that these women and men would have imbibed just as a part of the culture they grew up in. So to understand post-apostolic and patristic Christianity, it's absolutely essential to look at the way they synthesized two worlds, the one that they would have shaped and formed them, that classical world of literature of Homer, Hesiod, Virgil, and many other writers, as well as the biblical world. And when you tend to get with so coming to be of the Protestant Reformation, there's turn to the Bible and sola scriptura, and it tends to negate actually the vibrant and dynamic intellectual life of early Christianity as the thoughtful Christians of their time made sense of their Jewish heritage, the emerging New Testament, the slow canonization of the Bible, but also the revelatory insights, the common grace that can be found in Homer, and particularly the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it was the wise Homer, the saintly Homer. Now, of course, important to understand here too, that just as the pre-Socratic philosophers did not read Homer literally, in that sense, they read Homer allegorically, they read Homer in a tropological, a moral way, an ontological way. So the early fathers, so just as Philo in the Jewish tradition did not read his Hebrew canon in simply a literal way, that was there, the literal, historical, grammatical, but he also read it in the whole Alexandrian Jewish tradition, read it tropologically and allegorically and ontologically as well. And so the fathers and mothers of the church, they inherited great works of liturgy, biblical, and then the classical heritage, of which Homer was the reigning monarch, and the Odyssey and the Iliad were two key texts. So, but they also drew from a whole hermeneutic interpretive tradition, which was not literal, was not simply grammatical or linguistic, but it was applied for the formation of people in their process of deification and transformation. And Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were essential to that formation as well as the biblical tradition. And so many of the homilies or sermons we get in the East and West refer constantly to Homer, Hesiod, and in the Latin tradition, Virgil, as well as many others. So what I'd like to do is look at a couple of the themes in Homer's Iliad and then the Odyssey, which are repeated themes that you get in the early church by some of the bishops, the theologians, the exegetes, and were applied for formation, instruction, insight, spiritual direction. These were standard texts in that process. So I'll light down a few of them, and there are many more I could touch on, but they can be found regularly in the works of these great writers of the East and West and their late antique heritage. First of all, the Iliad. The Iliad is about war. It's about the struggle, obviously. You have Paris and Helen going to Troy, and then the Greeks going to Troy and the battle there. G.K. Chesterton said some great themes of literatures. The Iliad teaches us that life is a struggle. The Odyssey teaches us it's a pilgrimage, and Job teaches us that in fact there is suffering, and often it's a mystery trying to make sense of it. Well, certainly in the Iliad, the whole theme is that the journey is an agon. In fact, one has to constantly confront one's own soul, one's own heart, one's own betrayal, and that's the nature of the journey itself. This is where we get our word protagonist, antagonists. And so the notion that somehow grace comes into people's life, what Bonhoeffer will call cheap grace, and there is no struggle, one is magically reaches a point of peace and quietness without substantive struggle. The Greeks understood costly grace, that it is humans working together with the divine, and of course this is played out in the Iliad, where the interaction between the divine and humans in the midst of the battle. But this was interpreted in terms of formation that never ignore the fact that life is going to be a struggle in terms of inward desires, misplaced longings, and until people are willing to face those, they will become sort of the slaves of misdirected desires and longings and thirsts. And so to be attentive, to be alert to what's going on. And of course, much of the Iliad is the struggle, the battle itself, and the weaknesses of people. So you have Achilles' heel, the great warrior Achilles, who seemed, he could overcome everything. But can each person name their Achilles heel, their weak spot, their temptations, the place where they can go askew? Because that's where the arrow will be fired by the Hectors that can take the very best out. And so the Iliad is all about this. Also, with the Iliad, you have Odysseus is torn between home, Ithaca, Penelope his wife, Telemachus his son, and the challenge of big issues themselves, threats to the city-states of Greece. What's the tension a person has to live in a faith journey between family and larger issues themselves that can be challenging politically within issues of the church itself? How does one live that tension without sacrificing the one or the other? Many can sacrifice family, children for the sake of some big religious concern, or some people just slip into just the family is everything and ignore the larger world. So that's shire politics. So how does one live in the tension? Of course, this is Odysseus's story as he leaves Ithaca, his home. So this was another key element of the tension between home on the one hand, shire, family, and yet the larger calling, in this case, led him to war and politics and away from home, and this tension that anyone who's trying to make sense of their faith journey has to engage in itself. Now, the thing with Odysseus, you get the war is over. The Greeks defeat the Trojans. Of course, the Trojan horse is a key figure in that story itself, as be wary of letting your guard down, because often evil will slip in. The old saying, beware of the Greeks who come bearing gifts. Beware of evil when it comes in a Trojan horse, and do people know how to discern that? And so it's similar to, in one sense, the story of Eden when the serpent appears as an angel of light. Well, the Trojan horse is just the angel of light, which looks like a gift. It looks like peace, but it is not peace, in fact. It's a way of using peace to smuggle in and defeat the enemy in this case. So the Trojan horse is a key symbol the early church looked at constantly. Now, Odysseus, finally, the war is over and he starts hitting home. In the early church, many of the homilies dealt with Ithaca as the eternal kingdom, this longing for home, this longing for the eternal, this longing for the ultimate, and yet we still are on a pilgrimage through time. So we haven't made it to Ithaca, we haven't made it to the New Jerusalem. There's a journey, there's a pilgrimage to be taken, and so Odysseus's journey itself, constantly being challenged and longing for home, and not denying that longing, but also realizing it was a journey, it was a pilgrimage across the water of time. Now, he's a sailor, Odysseus is, so this was a key element as well, which you get the ship of state, but you also get the church as a ship. Many sanctuaries in the church are built on the model of the ship itself. And so the whole notion of sailing across the waters of time, in which life itself, the waters can be unpredictable, the weather can be unpredictable, and the tendency of people who do not know how to sail or live their faith life meaningfully through the disciplines of the church can easily be thrown off course, and they don't know how to orient. So what is the means that people learn to orient, not only in fair weather, but the test of a real sailor or person of faith is how they orient in the storms of life, when the water threatens to capsize the boat, or the winds of time, which are not always the most desirable. But then also the ship is seen not only as Odysseus sailing, but the women and men on the ship compared to the church once again. The whole ship which sails across time. How do women and men on the ship, in this case mostly men obviously, as they're sailing back, what happens when they have disagreements? What happens when there's threats of mutiny on the Bounty? when people collide in terms of the direction home, and when there's disagreements about how you get back to Ithaca. And so inevitably there's disagreements on the ship of the church. And so who's the captain on the ship? And if you have various sailors challenging one another and challenging the captain, what happens to the ship itself? And so always the issue was, if there is no captain on the ship and people have lost the ability to orient, the ship goes all over the water and often shipwrecks itself. And so the church itself, the issue was, who are the captains? And this can be applied also to desires. So within the soul itself, we can have competing desires like sailors on the ship, pulling the oars in different directions. And if there is no captain on the ship, then you'll have these sailors of competing desires pulling the ship in a variety of directions and never reaching port or Ithaca of home itself. As the journey continues with Odysseus and the sailors, they inevitably have to get between Scylla and Charybdis. These are two rocks. And Scylla is the monster who has a ravenous appetite that can never be quenched. Now this, when applied to the soul, is who are those who are constantly hungering and devouring experiences, relationships, amusements, divergence, but they can never be satisfied. And Scylla and Charybdis is like the whirlpool. If a person is not careful, they're drawn into a whirlpool, sucked into it. And of course, with Odysseus and the ship, he loses many of his sailors as he skirts through Scylla and Charybdis itself. So if people are not aware of the temptations from without and from within, those multiple desires or sailors can be consumed themselves if they're not careful. Scylla and Charybdis then are metaphors of ravenous longings that can never be fulfilled. And if one follows them, they become addictions. And then one is drawn to this whirlpool in which they're sucked away and they lose any sense of stability or centering in any sense whatsoever. And so then, of course, as they're moving along, there's the sweet, sweet sound of the sirens. Okay, so here you have evil appearing and appealing with these lovely songs, attractiveness, and how can people possibly resist? Important to note that the sailors had just come from painful and difficult challenges in Scylla and Charybdis. So what they longed for was peace, bounty, quietness in which they could rest. Well, that was the siren song. Give me the place of rest, the island where I'll be taken care of, I'll be tended, I'll be cared for, I'll be babysat, my soul will be taken care of. Well, after struggle, people are very vulnerable to the flip side, in which they can very much be tantalized by the promise of comfort and security. Struggles are now over. We'll give you the drug of quietness and peace, and the journey of pain and difficulty and clashes is over. So between the intense agon of Scylla and Charybdis and both the sirens, who the song is attractive, it's seductive, it draws them in, they're torn between the two. And so for Odysseus, he knows what's going on. He's been warned by Circe and his time on that island. So with the sailors, he puts wax in their ears. So within every person's soul, when they're drawn by the siren, do they know how to put wax in the ears of their soul so they're not tantalized seductively by the siren's song? Odysseus knows he can't withstand the sirens, and so he asks his sailors to tie him to the mast of the ship. So he'll know the temptation, but he's tied to the mast. Now, the mast, obviously, in the ship is the cross. The ship, and this is constantly used in the Father's writings, is that to the degree a person will know the temptations, but are they tied? Because the mast in the ship and the crossbar is a cross. And so you get Odysseus being tied to the cross, and is the cross, when he's tied to it, even though he knows the temptations of the sirens, because he is tied to the cross and what it means to die to that and eventually to get away through it. But it is the cross that holds Odysseus, the place of death, and finally sailing past that. And so these are also key figures in the spiritual and soul formation. You also get, in Greek thought, you get Penelope. She's constantly, everyone says Odysseus has died, and you have the suitors using various means. So you have the sly Penelope. She basically tells the multiple suitors that she's forming a tapestry, and when she's done, she'll choose one of them. But she stitches all day, then she unstitches all night. And she's a very wise woman, Penelope. She's not sure whether Odysseus is alive or dead, but she hopes, and she senses he's coming home, but there are no proof. And of course, everyone, the suitors, constantly want to drive her to depression, hopelessness, despair. It's over, give up. And so the temptation of Penelope is despair, cynicism, quitting, and capitulating to a lesser good. And so, but Penelope has the character in that sense, like Odysseus in different ways, and she's faithful with him to the end. And so you have the wise Penelope who does not give in to despair, cynicism, bleakness, depression, the sense that it's over, and she has to marry the suitors who she's not drawn to in any way. Telemachus, the son, is the typical story of the son who has no father, longing for the father, but not knowing if he will ever come home. And fascinating story there between sons who have no fathers, or they may have fathers, but the fathers are not there for them. It's interesting when Telemachus returns, and obviously when Odysseus returns, and this is where they drew very closely, obviously, to Christ, is Odysseus, when he returns to Ithaca, it looks in many ways that many on the island or the city-state assumed Odysseus was dead, and they were doing what they could to get Penelope to marry them. Odysseus returns not as a king. He returns in secret as a beggar, as an old man. And so he slyly comes in, and his son met him before he came to the city and said, these suitors have taken advantage of mother, your wife. They have abused our house. Can you come quickly to deal with them? He said, no, wait when the time is right. But what I'm going to do is come in secret, and people won't recognize me. So he comes back to Ithaca, to his house, as a beggar, as a poor man. And of course he's mocked and he's scoffed because Telemachus brings him in as just an old man who is of no use and can't do anything, but allows Odysseus at this point to see exactly what's happening in his house and who are the people. But just as so, Christ comes concealed, only fully revealed in the Transfiguration. So Odysseus comes concealed as a beggar. He's rejected, he's marginalized, he's scoffed, he's mocked. And it is only at the end that he finally reveals who he is, the one who can stitch together the bow, fire the arrow through the various notches. And in that sense, he is transfigured as the true Odysseus, who becomes the king of Ithaca once again. But if people only look at the warrior king, only look at the one who comes on the horses with the chariots, they miss the very presence, in this case, of the king of Ithaca, or the divine, who is cloaked as a beggar and concealed, actually, and only the wise can see how in the beggar is the true king. It's the prince and pauper story. And so Odysseus also becomes, in that sense, a Christ-like figure within the Odyssey itself. And so within the church tradition of the patristic era, the Iliad and the Odyssey were two key texts, both with internal formation, but the nature of how Christ himself could be seen in an implicit form in Odysseus and the return to Ithaca, but also the soul's longing for the new Jerusalem, and yet the journey that has to be taken in community on the ship of the church, the tensions within the ship of the church, and the many challenges to those on the journey, both internal and external. And if they weren't careful, they could easily be thrown overboard. They could be drawn into Scylla, Charybdis. The sirens could take advantage of them. The sirens was also used not only psychologically, but often the siren songs of heretics as well by the early church. And so that metaphor of the sirens was foundational to the thinkers of the East and West as a theological term, as well as a psychological, spiritual term, of people being very wary of the sweet song of ideas or the sweet lure of physical appetites or psychological appetites that would only lead to wreck and ruin. And so in sum, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was foundational in terms of the patristic era for soul formation. And when the Iliad and the Odyssey was read allegorically and tropologically, it could also be read typologically and ecclesially as well, it was almost as sacred in terms of formation for many of the mothers and fathers as was the Bible itself.